Millions of Catholics around the world are in mourning after the death of Pope Francis from a stroke and heart failure. He was 88.
It was a headline that shook the world. Pope Francis has died. Flags lowered, bells tolled, and the world mourned the passing of what some consider the most controversial pontiff in modern history.
I think he was a pope of the developing world. He was a pope of the poor. He was a pope who spoke to and from the margins of society.
But as the tributes poured in, so also did the whispers. Was it really just health complications? Or was there a power struggle inside the Holy See? In this video, we're digging through hidden reports, dissecting official footage frame by frame, and uncovering testimonies that have been covered up for ages. What we found would not only explain what really happened to Pope Francis, it had changed the Church forever. A pope of firsts. Pope Francis was born Jorge Mario Bergoglio on December 17, 1936, in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He grew up in a lively home with his parents, Mario and Regina, and his 4 younger siblings. In 1958, he entered the Jesuit novitiate and spent years studying philosophy and theology, balancing his love of learning with moments of prayer and silence. He was ordained a priest in 1969, and from 1973 to 1979, he led the Jesuit community in Argentina as provincial superior. Those years were challenging. Argentina was going through political unrest, and many people suffered. Bergoglio quietly worked to protect priests and lay people alike, often acting behind the scenes to keep dialogue open between different groups. In 1998, he was appointed Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and in 2001, Pope John Paul II made him a cardinal. As a church leader, he became known for his humility. He chose to live in simple housing rather than the grand archbishop's palace, cooked his own meals, and took public buses to visit parishes. He reached out to the poor, the sick, and those on society's margins, always reminding people that the church exists to serve.
The Holy Spirit, by enabling us to live a new life in Christ, takes away our hearts of flesh.
On March 13, 2013, the cardinals elected Jorge as Pope Francis. He was the first Jesuit pope, the first from the Americas and the Southern Hemisphere, and the first non-European pope in more than 1,200 years. When Francis was elected pope, his only surviving sibling, Maria Elena Bergoglio, admitted she'd once quietly prayed that he wouldn't be chosen. During the previous conclave, I was praying for him not to be elected, because I didn't want my brother to leave, she said. It's a position that was a little selfish. Yet when the white smoke curled from the Sistine Chapel chimney, she found herself pleading for divine guidance. I prayed that the Holy Spirit would intervene and not listen to me, and it didn't listen to me. It did what it wanted. Once Francis became pontiff, he entrusted Maria Elena with a special mission. He said, "I cannot call everyone. We are a very big family, so please send them my love, because if I call everyone, it will empty the Vatican coffers," she recalled, laughter softening her tone. In that moment, the new pope revealed both his affection for family and his wry sense of humor. Another branch of the Bergoglio clan, his niece Cristina, has carved out her own path as a visual artist in Madrid. In 2018, she reflected on the rarity of their meetings. "I do not see him anymore. Not because I don't want to, but because I respect his job as a spiritual messenger very much, and because I am also very busy with my work." Beyond Maria Elena and Cristina, any other living relatives have chosen to remain out of the public eye, quietly observing from afar as their loved one guides more than 1 billion faithful. Pope Francis's first days in office felt like a fresh breeze in St. Peter's Square. On March 17, 2013, he stepped out onto the central balcony and greeted thousands of pilgrims gathered below. With a warm smile, he lifted his arms and blessed the crowd, his voice strong yet gentle. But before he pronounced that blessing, he asked those standing in the cold spring air to pray for the man he had just succeeded, the Bishop Emeritus of Rome, Pope Benedict XVI, and for himself, the new Bishop of Rome. In that simple, heartfelt request, you could feel his humility and his sense of shared journey with all who believe. Just 2 days later, on March 19th, Francis held his official inauguration mass in the same vast square. The ceremony felt both grand and down-to-earth. Flags from every continent fluttered in the breeze as presidents, prime ministers, and religious leaders from around the world filled the seats. And yet, Francis's words weren't about power or protocol. In his homily, he focused on Saint Joseph, Jesus' earthly father, because March 19th is Joseph's feast day in the church's calendar. He spoke about Joseph's quiet strength, his faithfulness, and his willingness to serve without seeking glory. Francis invited everyone present to find in Joseph a humble model, someone who works in the shadows, someone who trusts without seeing, and someone who cares for his family with all his heart. 2 days before that Mass, on March 16th, he welcomed journalists to his first audience as Pope. It was an intimate moment, cameras and microphones trained on him, yet he spoke like an old friend. He revealed why he chose the name Francis. It was in honor of Saint Francis of Assisi, the saint famous for loving the poor, caring for the earth, and living a life of radical simplicity. Francis said that during the final rounds of voting in the conclave, Cardinal Claudio Humes of Brazil embraced him and whispered in his ear, "Don't forget the poor." At that moment, Jorge thought of Francis of Assisi, of his open arms, of his joy in living simply, and so the name was born. It was a historic choice. No pope had ever taken the name Francis before. The Vatican was quick to clarify that his official name is simply Francis, not Francis I. If another pope ever chooses Francis in the future, then this man will become Francis I, and a second would be Francis II. Until then, he remains the only one. Francis also smiled as he shared some lighter moments from the conclave. He said that some cardinals had joked with him about what name he might choose. One suggested Adrian, recalling Adrian VI, a 16th century pope known for his efforts to reform the church. Another teased Clement, to settle old scores with Clement XIV, who once suppressed the Jesuit order. Jorge laughed at these suggestions, but knew in his heart that Francis of Assisi was the guide he needed most. Looking back, he admitted that if he had been elected back in 2005, when Pope John Paul II died, he would have picked John XXIV in honor of John XXIII, whom he called the Good Pope. He told Cardinal Francesco Marchesano that he admired John XXIII's openness, his gentle spirit, and his willingness to bring the church into dialogue with the modern world. "John," Jorge said, "I would have called myself John, like the good Pope. I would have been completely inspired by him." One breath at a time. Pope Francis lived much of his life with a fragile chest. As a young man, he lost part of one lung, and ever since, respiratory troubles have been a looming shadow, especially in the cold months. Over the past few years, those troubles grew more serious, showing how even a man of great faith and strength can be tested by simple things like breathing. Back in July 2021, the Pope spent 10 days in the hospital after surgeons fixed a narrowing in his bowel.
Pope Francis is in a Rome hospital tonight after undergoing intestinal surgery.
It was a routine fix, but for someone his age, any surgery carries risk. Then, in March 2023, he was back under hospital lights with bronchitis. The doctors gave him strong antibiotics through an IV drip. He bounced back, only to face more surgery in June 2023 to remove scar tissue in his intestines and repair a hernia in his belly wall. Through it all, he kept his sense of humor. He'd joke with nurses, thanking them for pampering him like a grandpa while he lay in bed. Since 2022, Francis's knees had started to betray him. He leaned on a wheelchair, a walker, or a cane to get around. He'd fallen a few times, each tumble reminding him, and the world, of his human limits. Yet, his spirit stayed unbowed. He would say, "The only throne I know is a wheelchair," and laugh, eyes twinkling. Winter in 2025 brought another challenge. On February 6th, Francis was diagnosed with bronchitis. The very next day, he was still greeting people, though he could no longer deliver his own speeches. An aide read his words aloud while he sat, gently nodding, saying afterward, "Breathing is my full-time job these days." A week later, on February 14th, he checked into Rome's Gemelli Hospital again for more tests and to treat that stubborn bronchitis. Most of us might curl up at home, but Francis remained faithful to his duties, even in a hospital bed.
From the balcony of Rome's Gemelli Hospital, it was a long-awaited hello.
On February 17th, the Vatican shared that his respiratory infection was complex and polymicrobial, meaning more than one germ was causing trouble. They had to tweak his medications. He was alert, praying and reading his breviary, but the fight was getting tougher. A day later, on February 18th, tests showed he had bilateral pneumonia. Both lungs were under siege. Francis, ever calm, spent the day sipping tea, praying, and flipping through newspapers. "I'm in good hands," he told a nurse with a trusting smile. By February 23rd, things were critical. Blood tests hinted his kidneys were under stress, yet he stayed sharp and alert, greeting visitors with a warm look. He was on high-flow oxygen, a constant hiss by his bedside. A few days later, on February 26th, there was a flicker of good news. His kidneys bounced back. He still had fluid in his lungs, so therapists visited twice daily, helping him laugh and cough that extra moisture clear. But on February 28th, he suffered a bronchospasm. His airways tightened so sharply that he inhaled vomit. Quick work by the medical team put him on non-invasive ventilation, and once again, he pulled through. "A speed bump," he quipped later, "but I'm still rolling." March 1st brought a calm night. Francis enjoyed a cup of coffee, read the morning papers, and for a moment, sat upright in his armchair, a small victory that felt huge. Yet 2 days later, on March 3rd, the Pope had 2 bouts of respiratory failure. Mucus had built up deep in his lungs, and his airways rebelled. Each crisis was a reminder of how delicate life can be. Through it all, Francis never lost his gentle humor. On March 8th, doctors noted gradual, slight improvement. On March 10th, they declared he was no longer in immediate danger, though he would stay hospitalized to finish treatment.
Pope Francis says that he is not considering resigning, that he is recovering well from his colon operation.
He marked the 12th anniversary of his papacy on March 14th from that same hospital room, sending a short video to the faithful. "Thank you for your prayers," he said, voice frail but steady. Finally, on March 23rd, 5 weeks after that scary pneumonia, Francis walked out of the Gemelli Hospital. He paused in the hallway, lifted his hand in blessing, and smiled. Cameras snapped. He looked tired, yes, and his steps were slow, aided by a nurse's arm. But his eyes shone with gratitude. That moment said so much. A man who had battled lung infections, surgeries, falls, and hospital routines, still standing. On March 26th, 2025, in a candid interview, Dr. Sergio Alfieri, the lead doctor overseeing Pope Francis's care, shared just how close the pontiff came to the edge. Twice during his 38-day hospital stay, Francis's condition turned life-threatening. The worst moment came on February 28th, when a violent coughing fit caused him to inhale vomit, triggering a severe respiratory crisis. "We truly thought we might lose him," Alfieri told an Italian newspaper, adding that, at one point, the team quietly debated whether to intervene or let nature take its course. It was, he said, the darkest day of the Pope's long and grueling fight to survive. The final blessing. Pope Francis's last public moment came on Easter Sunday, just 1 day before he passed away on Monday morning, April 21st, 2025. It was a scene both stirring and tender. The soft spring light spilling over St. Peter's Square, a crowd gathered in hopeful silence, and a frail but determined Pope stepping out to share one final message.
Pope Francis then, cheers from the crowds and a wave from the 88-year-old pontiff.
By that point, Francis had grown too weak to speak for long stretches. So, leaning on the help of an aide, he delivered words that cut straight to the heart, a clear, calm plea against any policies or attitudes that foster contempt for the vulnerable, the marginalized, and the migrants. He reminded everyone listening that our common humanity is far more important than any law or party line that pushes people to the edges. He went on to honor those who were observing Easter amid conflict zones. He called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza so families could know peace, for the swift release of Israeli hostages held far from home, and for an end to the suffering in Ukraine. Even in his weakened state, he spoke with the urgency of a shepherd tending to a flock in danger. Then, summoning all his remaining strength, he turned directly to the people before him and, his voice soft but unmistakable, greeted them. "Brothers and sisters, Happy Easter!" For a moment, you could almost forget how ill he had been. The crowd erupted. "Viva il Papa! Long live the Pope!" rang out, echoing off the ancient stones. One quietly powerful detail. There were no oxygen tubes in sight as he rode through the cheering crowd in his open-air Pope-mobile. It was only 3 weeks since he had been discharged from a 5-week hospital stay. Yet there he was, blessing babies pressed into his path, smiling as parents lifted their children heavenward. All the while, doctors had urged him to rest, to avoid big gatherings and conserve what energy he had left. Since leaving the hospital, Francis had been easing back into his work. He'd returned for several Sunday blessings in St. Peter's Square, each one a milestone in his gradual recovery. On Holy Thursday, he visited a Rome prison to wash and kiss the feet of inmates, an act echoing the service of Jesus at the Last Supper.
It was when Pope Francis celebrated the Mass at a refugee reception center.
But he wisely sat out the solemn Good Friday procession and the quiet vigil of Holy Saturday, so as not to overdo it before that final Easter appearance. Earlier on Easter Sunday, he'd even found time to meet briefly with U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, a devout Catholic traveling in Rome with his family. Vance, attentive to the Pope's well-being, greeted him with genuine concern. "I know you've not been feeling great, but good to see you in better health," he said. It was a friendly moment, though one laced with unspoken tension. Vance's tough stance on border security has long clashed with Francis's passionate calls for welcoming migrants and protecting refugees. Still, on that bright spring morning, those differences seemed less important than the shared respect for a man whose life was almost over. Behind closed doors, a close aide later revealed that Francis pushed himself despite doctors' warnings because, in his own words, he wanted to die on the battlefield. He saw his role as a pilgrim's journey, not from a comfortable throne, but in the thick of human struggle, standing beside the poor, the sick, the lonely. That final blessing on Easter Sunday captured the essence of his papacy. Here was a leader who chose solidarity over splendor, who believed that mercy matters more than power, and who never lost sight of the people he served. Even when his voice faltered, his message was unwavering. We are all brothers and sisters, and we must look after one another. As the Pope-mobile drifted away and the crowd slowly dispersed under the warm April sky, there was a sense that something profound had just happened. A quiet, unassuming farewell from a man who spent his life reaching out. It was more than a final public act. It was a portrait of a pope who lived and died among the people, sharing their joys and bearing their burdens. The final morning. Pope Francis's final morning began like any other. At 6 a.m., his alarm clock softly rang in the quiet rooms of the St. Martha residence. The Pope, now 88 years old, opened his eyes and sat up, ready to start another day of work and prayer. But within the hour, everything changed. Around 7 a.m., the pontiff suddenly felt unwell. Those close to him noticed his color had drained and his speech was slurred. Doctors rushed in, and, as they worked at his bedside, it became clear he was having a stroke. By 7:35 a.m., less than 90 minutes after waking, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, Pope Francis, had passed away peacefully, according to the Vatican's medical team. His death certificate, signed by Dr. Andrea Arcangeli, Director of Health and Hygiene of the Vatican City State, laid out the facts plainly. The immediate cause was a stroke, which led to a coma, and finally, an irreversible collapse of his heart and circulation. The report made clear that his body had finally given in to a series of health battles stretching back decades. Just months ago, Francis had survived a life-threatening bout of bilateral pneumonia.
But unfortunately, because of the pneumonia that he's been suffering from, he is no more.
He spent 5 weeks in Rome's Gemelli Hospital, fighting infections in both lungs and even early kidney stress. Nurses and doctors watched over him around the clock, amazed by his calm strength and gentle humor. He joked about dying on the battlefield, saying he wanted to stay close to those who suffer. And yet, in those corridors, the Pope showed his human side, sipping coffee, reading newspapers, and sharing a smile with visitors. On this final day, the morning's tranquility was broken by sudden alarm and urgent footsteps. Dr. Arcangeli and his team performed every test they could. They confirmed the stroke with scans, watched as the Pope slipped into a coma, and finally documented his passing with electrocardiographic thanatography, an official way to say his heart had stopped for good. "I hereby declare," Dr. Arcangeli wrote, "that the causes of death, to the best of my knowledge and judgment, are as stated above." Tributes to a gentle leader. When news of Pope Francis's passing reached the world, a wave of respect and sorrow swept across capitals and communities alike. Leaders from different nations and backgrounds shared personal memories and heartfelt thanks for a man who, even in frailty, had a powerful way of touching people's lives. Their words, though spoken in formal statements and social media posts, felt warm and genuine, like friends remembering someone who always put others first. In Washington, President Donald Trump spoke of the Pope as someone who truly cared about the world. He noted how hard the pontiff had worked and how much he loved people everywhere. To show respect, Trump said he had ordered flags across the United States to fly at half-staff.
I just signed an executive order putting the flags of our country, all of them, all federal flags and state flags.
A small but meaningful gesture, he added, to honor Francis's memory and the values he stood for. Vice President J.D. Vance offered his condolences to Christians around the globe, acknowledging the deep bond many felt with the late pontiff. He recalled seeing Francis just the day before, noting how fragile the Pope appeared, yet how his spirit shone through. Vance said he would always remember the moving homily Francis delivered at the start of the COVID crisis, an early sign of how the Pope's words could bring comfort in the darkest hours. Over in Rome, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni mourned the loss of what she called a great shepherd. She spoke of the privilege she felt in having Pope Francis as a friend and advisor, someone whose teachings guided her through both triumphs and trials. Even during the Pope's most difficult moments, she said, his words and counsel never wavered, offering steady support to those who, like her, sought hope amid hardship. Back in Argentina, where Francis first answered his calling, President Javier Milei took to social media to express his deep sorrow. He said it had been an honor to know the man behind the papal robes, even if they hadn't agreed on every issue. Those small differences, he admitted, seemed insignificant compared to the warmth and wisdom Francis had shown to everyone he met. In Paris, President Emmanuel Macron highlighted the Pope's lifelong commitment to those on society's edges. He pointed out how Francis had always stood with the most vulnerable and fragile, offering comfort in times of war and brutality. To Macron, the Pope's humble approach spoke louder than any grand speech. It was a reminder that true leadership often means bending down to lift others up. Former President Joe Biden reflected on how Francis made every person feel welcome. He said the Pope would be remembered as one of the most impactful leaders of our time, someone who brought equity to the forefront and tirelessly worked to end poverty and suffering. Biden spoke of Francis as the people's Pope, a beacon of faith, hope, and love who carried the Church's message into the hearts of millions. Former President Barack Obama shared his own reflections on the Pope's unique gift for inspiring people to aim higher in their daily lives. He described Francis's simple acts, embracing the sick, feeding the hungry, washing the feet of young prisoners, as gestures that broke through the noise of politics and power. To Obama, those humble, profound moments reminded everyone that we're tied together by more than headlines. We're bound by shared moral duties to one another. Each tribute painted a picture of a leader who reached beyond borders and beliefs. From Latin America to Europe to North America, people remembered Pope Francis not as a distant figure of authority, but as someone whose caring nature called out to our better angels. In their own words, these leaders thanked him for teaching us about mercy, urging us to stand up for the poor, and showing that kindness can be the strongest form of leadership. As candles flicker in churches and homes around the world, these collective memories form a web of gratitude. They show that Francis's legacy was built not on grand buildings or elaborate ceremonies, but on simple acts of compassion. The last journey of Pope Francis. Pope Francis's passing begins a 9-day period of shared mourning called the Noven Dial, during which Catholics worldwide pause to pray for his soul. Families and parishes offer masses, rosaries, and private devotions, recalling moments of his compassion and service. In Rome and beyond, believers unite in quiet remembrance, honoring a leader who made solidarity with the poor the hallmark of his ministry. Within St. Peter's Basilica, the late pontiff's body lies in state, robed in his papal vestments. Pilgrims, tourists, priests, and cardinals form slow-moving lines along the marble aisles. Many pause at the bier for a final blessing, making the sign of the cross or placing a hand over their heart, while the hush is broken only by soft footsteps, murmured prayers, and distant bell tolls. In that stillness, visitors feel a connection both to Francis and to each other, bound by grief and gratitude. After several days of public viewing, the funeral takes place under the open sky of St. Peter's Square. The Dean of the College of Cardinals, a 91-year-old senior prelate in this case, leads the liturgy, flanked by dozens of fellow cardinals clad in scarlet. Ancient prayers blend with moments of silent reflection as ordinary worshippers press forward to witness the rites. Heads of state, prime ministers, royalty, and religious leaders from around the globe converge on Vatican City, paying respects in a gathering that echoes the massive turnout for John Paul II's 2005 funeral, when about 4 million people and scores of dignitaries filled the square. While Rome hosts the central liturgy, churches everywhere join the memorial. From Manila to Buenos Aires, Lagos to Lisbon, cathedrals and local parishes hold daily prayer services and requiem masses. Altars are adorned with flowers and candles, hymns rise in concert, and homilies recall Francis's calls for mercy, justice, and care for the least among us. Across continents, this chorus of remembrance weaves a spiritual network that reflects the universal scope of his influence. Papal burial customs follow centuries-old patterns, but Francis chose simplicity over ceremony. Traditionally, a pope is interred 4 to 6 days after death in 3 nested coffins, cypress, lead, and elm, with a scroll of his life placed inside.
They will bring the body of Pope Francis into the Basilica on Wednesday to lie in state so the faithful.
Francis, however, requested a single plain wood coffin lined with zinc, an echo of his lifelong vow to live modestly and stand with the poor. Nearly 100 of his predecessors rest in the Vatican grottos beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Francis preferred to be laid to rest at the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore on Esquilino Hill, one of Rome's 4 great basilicas, and the final resting place of only 7 earlier popes, the last in the 17th century. With his burial, the church enters the sede vacante, the vacant seat period in which major decisions are put on hold and Vatican offices assume caretaker roles. Daily operations continue, but appointing bishops or convening synods waits until a successor is chosen. Roughly 2 to 3 weeks later, cardinals under 80 gather in the Sistine Chapel for the conclave. Sealed off from the outside world with all communications barred, they vote up to 4 times daily by secret ballot. A 2/3 majority is required to elect the new pope. If that threshold isn't met after 33 ballots, the 2 leading contenders face a final runoff. After each round, ballots are burned in a stove on the chapel roof. Black smoke signals another day without a decision, as crowds below watch and wait. Then, when white smoke finally appears, bells ring throughout Rome, proclaiming that a new pontiff has been chosen. At that moment, the church turns a page, beginning a fresh chapter shaped by the legacy of Francis and the hopes of Catholics everywhere. However, in the meantime, the man now entrusted with guiding the Catholic Church during this historic transition is none other than Cardinal Kevin Joseph Farrell, a Dublin native with humble beginnings and a remarkable ascent. Raised in the Irish-speaking suburb of Drumnach, Farrell grew up in a modest working-class home where faith and tradition were woven into daily life. Now that his chapter has closed, a question echoes across the globe. Who will rise to lead the church next, and what path will they choose to follow?